Roll with it. Roll with it. Roll with it. What else do you have to lose? Hey consumers, what's up? Today we're drawing pretty girls on Pinterest. Meow. So I just wanted to do a really quick portrait study. I don't know the model's name right now or the source of the image because one thing Pinterest is really good at is not sourcing the images. So I'll probably have it by the time of editing and then I'll throw it up on the screen. But basically we're just doing a real quick study and then we're doing crazy stuff. As for the painting itself, it's nothing too complicated. I've mainly been painting a bit to try and get used to like the actual act of laying colors in general. So yeah, I started in general by just laying out the features in a pencil. This is usually the easiest part of the painting for me because I'm not painting, I'm drawing. So it took me kind of a second to get adjusted to the painting process. I first started in by trying to lay out some shadows and I was kind of struggling with it. I feel like in general, when you're working on portraits, it's really hard to find that flow state when you're working on the painting because you can't help but notice how bad the shadows look or if colors are like kind of wonky. So a little bit into laying out those shadows, you can kind of see me give up and then I just kind of like paint over everything with some basic hues from the reference and try to like get a more overall feel on the different values in the portrait. I do feel like at a lot of different stages, I really hone in and try to like paint certain features in detail. I'm trying to get in the habit of not doing that until I have like the overall color look, but it's just really like tempting to get lost in the eyes, you know? I may have focused on rendering out those lips a bit more than I should have, but come on. Overall, once I was done with the features, I did speed through a lot of the other places. I feel like mainly my goal for the painting was focusing on those features and getting those basic face details. So once that's over, I kind of like sped through the hair and the body. That's usually the good thing about working on a portrait study is that you can decide which things you want to work on most and which things are a little bit less important. So once you feel like you've gotten the most out of it, you can like speed through the rest. Overall, I don't think the portrait was necessarily too bad. I think I painted it out pretty well. I don't necessarily think I got her likeness super good. I don't know if it really looks like her. I also did some weird funky stylizing thing with her eyes. I didn't render one of the eyes. This was pretending to be something just cute and creative, but actually I did this because the more I rendered her eye, the more weird it looked. So I figured, okay, I'll just kind of render one eye and then leave the other one totally blank. And hey, it's artistic license. I can do that as long as I can convince you that I did it for a reason and not just because I'm bad at my work. And then there, the portrait was done. And then things started to spiral out of control. One thing I've been thinking about lately in general is how I can sort of focus my videos or my work or anything that I'm doing to be more focused on the things that I want to do. The painting was cool and the painting was a much needed exercise, but could I have done more? Maybe. I should stop calling myself a character designer if I'm not going to character design. So let's make a character design. So one thing I usually like to do at the very beginning of a character design before I've even done thumbnails is just to do basic sketches of either my references or like things that are inspired by my reference to try and like loosen up and warm up to this idea of drawing from imagination and just kind of throwing down lines in general. I feel like doing something that's relatively comfortable and easy kind of warms you up and starts to get your brain going before you start thinking from a design perspective. That being said, this is the part where basically the opposite occurs. So I'm working through some sketches, not really thinking about design too much, just kind of thinking of like, oh, if this lady, this pretty Pinterest girl was a character, what kind of character would she be? And what you can proceed to have happen is see me fumble around with some sketches of her and just kind of overall like struggling to draw from imagination. Oops. Moving on to the actual design aspect, before I start making thumbnails, I kind of start to pick apart the reference photos and find what shapes seem to like stand out. What shapes do I feel are iconic? And what parts feel like they have consistent repetition throughout the drawing? I'm noticing parts like the silhouette that her hair makes where it's kind of like this leaf shape with like the jagged edges on the bottom side of it. And then these little ball shapes that the berries make. In general, I'm also trying to figure out what kind of feeling or vibe the reference has. One thing I am kind of doing is focusing a little bit more on my portrait study rather than the portrait itself, the reference. In the original portrait, you see a lot of like really strong saturated colors and it looks a lot like she's blushing. Whereas in my reference, it looks a lot more like she's sunburned, and that's kind of what I was going for when I was adapting the study. Once I basically have that iconography down, I start jumping down to thumbnails. Because this is a relatively quick idea, and this whole thing was a second-parter idea of a video that it wasn't even planned for, I'm not thinking too much of varying up my thumbnails. I'm kind of just seeing what kind of direction the reference is throwing me in and trying to build off of that instead of saying, oh, I'm going to make a certain number of thumbnails. Since I'm not necessarily too focused on making sure I've fully explored everything, we're just going to kind of make a basic wireframe of what kind of figure shape I'd want the character to have, and then build on top of that with simple colors to try and explore different outfit ideas and ways that the motifs can show through the design. So yeah, I'm basically starting with a silhouette, and then I'm kind of throwing down this idea of a character that I want is sort of like a sun solar goddess. So we're kind of mixing around with different armor options, and then I want to integrate the shirt that she has in the reference to kind of make a combination of both metal and fabric in her outfit. Something that feels powerful, but then also feels pretty balanced. She's supposed to look so powerful enough that she doesn't necessarily need a full suit of armor. Artistic license makes sure that I don't have to make armor that makes sense. I also added this really cool sort of horseshoe sun ray shape on her shoulder that I thought was really interesting because I thought it played into that whole sun effect. I believe it shows up on this time lapse, but I tried to add it on her leg too, and it wasn't really working that well. Once I went through that first thumbnail, I tried reiterating it on the second form to see if I could mess around and see what wasn't working in the first one. For the most part, I didn't really like the asymmetrical look as much as I thought I would. I tried, instead of doing a breastplate, to integrate it into more of like a abdominal slash hip armor slash thing to see if that would kind of make sense. And then I wanted to work with giving her like a fabric top instead of like a metal breastplate. That way I could mess around with like the creases and the design of the fabric shirt more. I think overall this worked a lot better. The metal pants maybe not so much, but over that I basically threw like this red tunic over to give her a more triangular shape and kind of move the size of her shape downward, which I felt like worked pretty well. She almost looks kind of like a solar mage or cleric, which seems pretty powerful, and I feel like kind of resonates with the motif a lot more than the more warrior aspect. And then I gave her these big cool golden blade thingies, and I kind of gave them like secondary iterations to look more like sun rays and kind of play into that magic look a bit. The main focus in this design process is that I was more focused on like just working through ideas and building off of them instead of saying, oh, I need to iterate a certain number of times or deliver these certain ideas. It's not necessarily good concept design, but it is concept design. And because I don't necessarily have experience, we're going with it. After I got through those thumbnails, I basically go back to free sketching her character a bit. I did struggle with the posing a lot of this, but I do feel a lot more warmed up with the posing in general than when I first started. So yeah, you can see me struggle with the hips a bit, but it does start coming back to me a lot better than it did in the very beginning. I am using a reference image for the original pose that I was going for, but I wound up going for a more crouched look because the straightedness of her legs didn't seem to be working with me, and I couldn't really figure out the pelvis direction. This part goes relatively quick too. Once I got a basic idea of the pose, I start to sketch through that armor, lay in the details, and then just basically clean it up as I go. Overall, it felt like a really good practice. I know I should have explored different armor shapes and stuff like that more, but I still try to incorporate a lot of those motifs in her design, all from the basic shape of like the thumbnails to like how the berry shape can be seen in the peg holes of her armor, to just overall trying to get her likeness or personality and what that reference photo was trying to show into the original character design. The overall basic gist of my goal was to take over something that seemed relatively basic practice and turn it into something more refined as far as what I want. It's not super challenging, it's not super complicated, and I don't really have a plan, but I'm doing it in general. And I think that's a lot of what this drawing or what being sunburned means. I think it's important in general to move towards the things that you want in life and what you're committed towards, even if you don't necessarily always feel planned or prepared. You don't want to waste time just hoping that you had more experience or skills, so you have to move towards the things you want boldly. You have to lay out into the sun and you have to move towards your goals, and even if you get burned, you have to wear these wounds with victory and confidence. These may be flaws, these may be damaged, but this is the thing that you want. You're on fire and you're burning, but at the end of it, it'll all be worth it for us. Anyways, yeah, this was basically just a portrait and design practice. Don't play it down. You know what? I designed, I did it, I didn't have a plan, and I did it. Anyways, thank you for sticking this through to the end with me. We'll see the real end of it together. I plan to draw many more pretty Pinterest girls and then completely derail onto crazy plans afterwards. If you like this sort of thing, I really appreciate feedback. Any comments and stuff like that, that would be super great. Maybe you could even subscribe. Subscribe to a guy called The Teeth Collector. What's the harm in that? Are you afraid?